So at first, like, how are you?
I'm doing really well. Have a bit of a cold. My
Sure.
voice, I think, is giving that away, but doing very well and sitting comfortably in the AC in this extreme heat. How are you?
I'm good. So thank you so much for coming and buzz with Aisha. Like it
My
was,
pleasure.
and at the same time, so I want to ask about your book Samsara. I have it. I read it. It's a nice one. So like, I just want to ask, like, what made you like? What inspired you to write such books? Like, what inspired you?
There's several things. Firstly, I've been waiting for that letter to Hogwarts. I don't think there are many magical fantasy worlds in India uh, that, are still fresh in 2023. So I wanted to create something along those lines and therefore give myself that Hogwarts letter. So that's the first reason. Um, Second reason is because classical Hinduism texts, namely the Rig Veda, Upanishads, the Purans, these are not known by people. Very few people know what is in the Rig Veda, and it is the oldest scripture in the oldest religion in the world. It is still in continued use around the Havan in Hindu weddings. But most people don't know of the Rig Veda. They don't know who is the primary god in the Rig Veda. And I am trying to, through this book, do my little bit, the little that I understand of it, and I'm trying to bring it forward. I'm trying to bring forward the core tenets of Hinduism that are mentioned in the ancient text. So
Okay,
these are the two reasons.
okay. So, like, I want to ask you, like, what are the challenges you face? Like, what research you did uh, when you were writing this book?
The research was twofold, uh, actually threefold. One was how to write. I started writing when I was 17, and it took me 10 years. That's
Okay,
because I taught myself how to write the book. And I was just a school student, and I wasn't even studying English in college, studying economics. So I had to teach myself how to write. And writing is mainly about editing. So I had to teach myself how to edit, which later led to my entry into the Penguin editorial team. So that was the first kind of research that went into it. Second research was world building research, how to write fantasy books, how to create a magical world. And for that, I relied heavily upon the famous authors that a lot of people know, whether it's Tolkien, whether it's Patrick Rothfuss, whether it's J.K. Rowling, whether it's Rick Riordan. So I used to look at how is it that modern day characters from 2023 or even C.S. Lewis's, Narnia a little in the past, how these modern day characters go from the reality of life to a wardrobe, to 9 3/4 platform, to the flu powder, to Camp Half Blood, or like in my book, to the Sri Nandan, and eventually how these characters get inside the world. So that is the second bit of research, which is world building, and I relied on these fantasy authors. And third and most important of the research that went to the 10 years of the making of this book is, of course, the understanding of the core tenets of Hinduism and the classical Hinduism text. Unfortunately, my introduction to Hinduism, classical Hinduism text, happened at the hands of Wendy Doniger, who is um, a translator from the US, who's often criticized for her anglicized perspective and literal translation. But luckily, it was an eye opener, and this happened very early. This happened in school, even before I started writing this book. And since then, I've had the great opportunity of trying to understand it myself, going around to different cities, Rishikesh, Pushkar, sitting with individuals that claim to have dedicated their life to understanding something so elusive like Rig Veda. They believe Rig Veda can't just be understood. It's not a linear story. It needs to be reflected against the Upanishads. So you need a guru, a lightness, a darkness remover, and a chela to understand. But eventually, I found myself happy and excited, uh, 5 years into the journey when I came across Sukumari Bhattacharya and her translations, foremost Sanskrit scholar and perhaps one of the most relied upon translators in India's history of the ancient texts, of the Rig Veda, of the Purans. And it is her translation that eventually helped me understand why in the Rig Veda the story of Indra versus Vritra is so powerful.
Okay. So as you told that you have been traveling to like Rishikesh, Kedarnath, like all the religious place, and you have been communicating with the people over there regarding this. So what are the like how is the conversation and what are the interesting conversation you came across? Like, do you want to share something?
There are all kinds of conversations. So one I remember in particular, Pushkar. I was walking down the steps of the only Brahma temple in the world. It's in Pushkar, and I was with a friend because we had gone to Pushkar for the sole purpose of trying to understand why is it that Brahma, the creator, is known as Prajapati in all the ancient texts. And who is Prajapati and why is Prajapati why is Prajapati so important, as important or more important than Brahma? And I said, what better place than to ask the priests of the only Brahma temple in the world? So I went there, and they told me about Prajapati, and they told me how, like a lot of other religions around the world, Greek, Egyptian, Norse, Japanese, there are tons that have many gods, polytheistic religions, right? Not one, not Christianity or Judaism or Islam, but polytheistic religions that have more than one god. How all of them have a creator, a mega creator. There is Uranus in Greek. But in Hinduism, in the Rig Veda, which is the oldest book, 2500 BC in the world, not just Hinduism, they talk about Prajapati, how he opened his mouth, and when out of his mouth came celestial beings. When it was day, they were called devas. When it was night and they were coming out of his mouth, they became asurs. So I learned about Prajapati, something that most people don't know about. Prajapati is the actual name of Brahm. And in the Tantric Hinduism era, he's called Brahm. It's the same thing. Rudra turned to Shiv, Indra became a title. There are a lot of, this is such a large religion. It's such an old religion, right? A way of life. So that was one interesting conversation. But I think the most interesting conversation was also in Pushkar, where I was trying. So my book is set in Gyangunj. Gyangunj is not a make-believe magical world. It is a world that is mentioned in the Vishnu Puranas. It's mentioned in the Vishnu Puranas as the place where Kalki ka janam ho. It's mentioned in the Rig Veda. It's mentioned in Kalachakra Tantra in Buddhism. 15th Dalai Lama has also mentioned in many speeches Shambhala and Siddhashram, different names for the same magical valley in the Himalayas. Shangri-La in China. It keeps on going on and on. Vanyasa, Siddhashram, Swakipur. There are many names. Kahin bhi aap dekhoge, they all refer to the same magical valley in the Himalayas. So I went to Pushkar asking I was asking Rishi Muniji, and he was saying, Aapko kaise pata? How do you know of this place? I said, it's mentioned in the Vishnu Puranas. He's like, yeah, but no one really focuses on it. Why are you obsessed with it? And then he told me to go to Rishikesh. And in Rishikesh, I found people who are meditating. Because in the Buddhist understanding, you can't walk to Gyangunj, Vanyasa, Siddhashram, Shambhala, Shangri-La. You have to reach there spiritually. You have to get enlightened. So there are all kinds of people who are trying to find it. Some people are dedicating their entire life, 40 years, trying to find it. Some people go to the Himalayas, meditating and roaming around trying to find it. The Chinese have done their own thing. There was a British pilot in 1933 who wrote a book called Lost Horizon. James Hilton wrote it. It was about a British pilot who was coming to Calcutta and his plane crashed in the Himalayas. And he reached Calcutta 10 years later saying, I was fine. I found Gyangunj. So there are very, very interesting things around it. But I think it's always my conversations around this magical hidden valley in the Himalayas where they believe Hindu gods exist even today and secretly control the nation and its politics that I had the best conversation.
Okay.